BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, a real-time test for TB.
If it works, we could take badger poo from latrines and detect whether there's TB in the badger sets, or we could look at cattle poo and look at whether there's TB in slurry, for instance.
More on that trial later. But let's start with that most important of rural places, particularly at this time of year, the pub. It hasn't been an easy few years for pubs. The Campaign for Real Ale, CAMRA, estimates that 2024 will have seen the closure of around 1,200, continuing a long-standing trend within the hospitality sector. Well, this week we'll have a look at how rural pubs are faring and at some of the extra things publicans are doing to keep the village local alive. First, let's get an overview of the challenges facing them. Kate Nichols is CEO of UK Hospitality.
I think rural pubs are facing a perfect storm at the moment. They've got rising costs coming through as a result of changes in the budget. But on the back of that, we're already facing food price inflation, energy inflation, labour challenges. But on top of that, you've now got NICs, which is the national insurance contributions that businesses have to make. It's a tax on employment that the employer is bearing, national living wage, and of course, changes to property taxation coming through. And at the same time, you're facing a cost of living crisis, and that's seeing a downturn in footfall. And as a result of that, businesses are struggling to be able to remain afloat.
Isn't that the same, though, for any pub? Are rural pubs really any worse off?
Well, I think what we are seeing, yes, is a situation where rural pubs are worse off. Over the course of the COVID period, we lost around 12% of rural pubs from March 2020 to March 2024. In contrast, we lost around 15 to 20% of normal pubs in all parts of the country, but 25% of city centre pub, bars and restaurants closed over that same period. But if you look in the last year, things have changed. You've started to see city centre, suburban and neighbourhood businesses recovering better, but actually we've still seen a higher closure number of rural pubs. So there's something definitely going on.
And there is a knock-on effect, isn't there, in a village when it loses its pub?
Absolutely. These pubs are not just sort of small businesses in their own right, economically important, though they are, and they do provide vital rural employment. They are intricately connected with their community and with their local supply chain. So they'll tend to buy from local farmers, local food manufacturers, but they'll also provide, as I say, local employment. But they provide the cultural and social hub of their communities. Often they're also shops, they're also post offices, they're where the local groups come to meet. And when you lose a pub, we know that community asset is lost for good, and that we're all collectively worse off as a result of that.
We have seen a rise, though, in the number of community-run pubs, which, as you suggest, also diversify into being really a village hub as well as a pub.
Yes, we have. The government has provided funding through Pub is the Hub to be able to make sure that communities who want to retain their pubs can come together, club together to be able to buy it if they can't buy it outright themselves. It does provide a grant and it provides support so that they can maintain these vital facilities.
Are there solutions for the average village pub, which is facing a tough time at the minute? What can they do?
I think there are solutions that are coming through from a legislative point of view. The government is looking to reform business rates, and that is critical. And then it is about diversifying as well, making sure that they retain close links with their community and provide the service that their customers want.
Kate Nichols. As we mentioned there, some communities now own their own pub. Almost 200 pubs across the UK have been taken over by local people, and these community-owned hostelries have an impressive track record in surviving various economic storms. Bob Walker spent an evening at the Radnor Arms in New Radnor in Powys, which is preparing to reopen after 8 years.
My name is Sue Norton and I'm the chair of the Radnor Arms Community Benefit Society. It's the last pub in the village. There was a deep sense of grief in the village. The committee at the time had to produce a survey of what the community wanted from a pub. They had to look at how they were going to raise the money. We actually then put a share offer together. We were looking for 180,000 as our ideal amount. We actually raised 200,000, which we could then match fund with a grant from the Community Ownership Fund.
My name's James Kinsey-Jones. My family's been farming within the valley for the past 100 years, and I'm actually a member of the Radnor Arms CBS committee as well. Without the pub, there's no sort of heart and centre to the village. There's no focus for people to come and meet and socialise. So it's incredibly important for farmers, especially because it is a pretty isolating lifestyle.
There is a problem nationally with a number of pubs that are closing, but there are those that might argue that that's not a bad thing because it's probably good that people aren't drinking so much. It's not a healthy place to go.
I'd say they're wrong. In a place like this, especially in the winter, there isn't much going on. There aren't many places you can go and see and interact with other people. It's really cornerstone to everything that happens, whether it's young farmers, the local football club, and everything else that happens in the village. So sort of cohesion of the community, which isn't really provided by any other entity, you know.
A rural pub, a community pub, is much more than just a pub. Very often you can come into a pub and even if you don't speak to anyone, you don't feel alone. You actually feel part of a community.
James, we all know that pubs, rural pubs in particular, are closing all the time. Why should this one be any more successful?
Everyone here has a vested interest because they're typically all shareholders in the pub. That structure alone means that everyone's willing to put energy, time and commitment to the pub, which they might not otherwise do.
It's great to see a pub reopening in a community like this, but it costs a lot of money. And is this only viable in a community where there are people with a lot of money?
I think from a community benefit share offers, very often the shares are set at about £250. In this community, the community voted that the shares should be £25 each, which would then enable anyone in the community to become part of the project. And we have benefited from that because we have a huge amount of people who bought shares who would never have been able to afford them.
Bob Walker reporting there from the Radnor Arms. More on pubs all week. Scientists at Cardiff and Aberystwyth Universities have won more than £1 million worth of funding for a trial which they hope will create a real-time test for bovine TB. The project will use handheld microwave technology to remove DNA from cattle and badger poo samples, which will then be tested for TB on the spot. If it works, it will be a massive boost for farmers across the country, where the disease costs the government alone £150 million a year. Sally Challoner reports.
I'm at Cardiff University in the Redwood building, which is the School of Pharmacy. I'm in a lab and it's very much what you might imagine. Lots of vials and bottles and microscopes. But something very extraordinary is going to happen here. And I've come to Professor Les Bailey. Is this your microwave? This is, yes, about the size of a pack of cards, little metal thing.
It is. So if you actually decided to pull your microwave to pieces, which I don't advise you do, you'll find there's a box, but the actual business end is the thing that develops the power, which is what you're looking at now. So we've been able to adapt that, and then with some clever bits of 3D printing, develop a device that's able to then microwave the organisms and extract the DNA. Microwaves have been used for lots of applications, including mobile phones, but to actually use them to break open organisms and detect the DNA quickly is perhaps a new application. And really that arose as a conversation with some microwave engineers in our School of Engineering. So biologists and engineers sat in a pub, had an idea and thought this is cool, which is why we're actually doing it this way.
So with the microwaves, you break open the bacteria and out comes the DNA, and then you can tell what that is.
We can tell what that is by using a bit more molecular biology, where we can actually specifically recognise those pieces of unique DNA from the bacteria. Through that recognition, we get something called fluorescence, where you get this burst of light, and that burst of light is indicative of it being the bug you want.
And all this, you're hoping, I know you're a Star Trek fan, is going to fit in the size of a zapper.
Well, I'm old enough to remember Spock and the tricorder used to whiz around on the planet, and the whole concept of having that type of device. We really want a technology that doesn't require clever scientists and people with degrees in computing. We want something where you press a button and you get a result there and then.
Well, after the DNA has been extracted, the next stage is to develop an optical device to analyse it. Over to the team at Aberystwyth University, which also hosts the Bovine TB Centre of Excellence. Its head is Professor Glyn Hewison.
That optical sensing device is being developed by the engineering department here at Aberystwyth University. And then we in the Centre of Excellence for Bovine TB create samples, we spike samples so we know how much TB is in those samples, and we work out how sensitively we can detect that DNA and how reliably we can detect that DNA.
You're just at the start of this project, but this could be game-changing, couldn't it, if it works?
Well, there's always this discussion about whether you can detect the bug that causes the disease or the immune response that the animal makes to the disease. So the skin test response that we use for most of the TB control, that detects the immune response, not the bug itself. So you can imagine if you could detect the bug in certain samples, you could really start to make quite interesting management decisions around tuberculosis control.
And when you talk about samples, we're talking about poo.
We will be testing it on poo to start with, but also for human use, we'll be testing sputum. And you can imagine that other liquid samples such as milk or blood could also be used. But our first testing regime is against poo so that we can look at how much TB might be in the environment. If it works, we could take badger poo from latrines and detect whether there's TB in the badger sets, or we could look at cattle poo and look at whether there's TB in slurry, for instance. One of the things we don't know about bovine TB, especially here in Wales, is how much TB there is out there in badgers. And this would be a rapid way of doing surveillance of TB infection in wildlife so that we get a much better evidence base for how much TB really is in wildlife.
Professor Glyn Hewinson. That's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Rebecca Rooney, and Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.